Welcome back. I've had a lot of poor performances in games recently, and a lot of them have been on camera on this channel, specifically rapid games in which I do okay through the opening and then I find a way to mess it up during the middle game. But not everything's going poorly. Recently I had a game that I did really well in according to the game review that I ran just afterward, and I want to go through it with the analysis tab, which runs at a deeper depth, to see how good it really was. This was a bullet game, and normally I don't run a very deep analysis on bullet games. Every now and then, only in cases where I think there's something very specific that I can learn. But in this game, as you can see, it says my opponent and I both played with about 93% accuracy. This game went for 78 moves. Now here it does say that we each had one blunder. On the game review that I ran on the app, it said we didn't have any blunders. But for some reason here in the browser, it says I had a blunder fairly early and gave my opponent a huge advantage, and then some number of moves later, they blundered and gave it back to me. That's what the little block there, the white block in the graph is. But otherwise, you can see that the graph is very straight and even, where neither one of us had a significant advantage. Now, what's just hidden behind the corner of my camera view there is it says I had 12 great moves. I want to find out, number one, are those really great moves? And number two, what my blunder was and what I should have done instead. It says both my opponent and I had 32 excellent moves. My opponent had 31 best moves. I had 23 best moves, but that's not including my 12 great moves. We should end up pretty impressed by this game, except for the one blunder on my part and then the one blunder on my opponent's part. I'm going to switch to the analysis tab, which as we know, runs at a deeper depth, and go through this game. Hopefully we can all learn something here. It started off as a Caro-Kann defense, which is when I play c6 as a response to white's e4. We ended up with the exchange variation, which I don't see quite as often as the advanced variation, but we still see it. And white played c4 here, which is one of the top moves. And I think what I'm supposed to play here is e6 to protect my d-pawn or get the knight out, also to protect the d-pawn, which I didn't realize because I thought the d-pawn was currently protected from this attack. But that's what Stockfish is saying. Or it's saying I can go ahead and take it and we'll still be close to even. But I've been so ingrained in the Caro-Kann defense to try to get this bishop out before I push the e-pawn that I did that, and it still says we're fairly close to even. My opponent played one of their better moves here, protecting their center pawn, exerting control over another center square, and then here I did play e6, which was one of my top moves. And now I think here they're supposed to take, because my opponent's already missing one of their center pawns, their e-pawn, and I have two. If they take here and I take back, then we each have one center pawn. But it's not that much worse to do what they did, which is to get this bishop out in preparation to castle. I played my best move here, which is to get that bishop out with check, which wins a tempo and then allows me to get this knight out in castle. Normally here I would expect white to block with their knight to c3, but instead they blocked with that bishop, which that allows me still to have the tempo here because I take that with check, and they have to take back with either the queen or one of the knights, which they did, one of their top two moves. Now I can get my other knight out in castle. Stockfish recommends taking this pawn or getting this knight out to e7 or playing knight to c6. Now I'm not sure why those are supposedly better than knight to f6, but they are, yet the evaluation shows we're still very close to even. My opponent played their absolute best move, which was to challenge this undefended pawn here, and I played one of my top two moves, which is to defend that pawn, but not all the way out here where our queens are facing off, which I don't really like, because if they take there, then I end up with double pawns. Yes, I do have an open file for the rook, but this is just as good. As you can see from the evaluation, we're both at even here. There are several moves that maintain exact equality, and my opponent castled, and my best move is to castle. So far we're playing absolute best moves. My opponent played one of their best moves, which is to put the rook on a file that's possibly about to become an open or semi-open file here. Whether I take their pawn and they take back, or whether they take my pawn, or if they just push past, they've got a rook behind it. My absolute best move is to block that pawn's push by playing knight to c6, which I did. Now it's not listed as one of my opponent's top moves to take this pawn here, but it makes sense given that they've just put the rook behind it to take control of this open file, and of course it would be lined up with my queen. So they did take it, and I can take back with either my knight or my pawn. I chose my pawn, which gives a slight advantage to my opponent, and they played one of their better moves. Now here I am supposed to contest this open file, or put a rook here on this pawn. And I think I understand the reason for putting the a rook on b8 to protect the b pawn is because I might have to move this queen momentarily, and then the queen wouldn't be protecting this pawn anymore. So I think those two make sense to me, but I didn't notice that. Or it says to go ahead and offer this queen trade again and get the queen off of that file now. That would serve the purpose of protecting this pawn, as well as getting the queen out of the path of the rook. I chose to protect the b pawn a little more slowly. I played a6 thinking that I would then play b5, and then I could put the queen behind it this way. That turns out to be not that bad. My opponent was supposed to do something similar if they want to play over here on the A file, is to move to play A3, but instead they went ahead and jumped up and played A4, which again, isn't that bad. You can see from the evaluation that it's dead even at zeros. And here is where I blundered according to the game review, but I don't know how big of a blunder it is. Again, Stockfish wants me to contest this fully open file, or even with this rook from over here to come over to E8. Or again, put the rook on B8, assuming to protect the B pawn. Because now I can't go ahead with my plan, which my opponent anticipated, which I think is why they played A4, to prevent me from going ahead with B5. Well, I came up with the bright idea of putting my knight on A5. Now, the idea there is that, yes, my queen would be hanging at that point, but so would their queen. And the knight there on A5 would be guarding the pawn on B7. I think maybe the reason that it's a blunder is that if we go through with that exchange, they take my queen, I take their queen, then they can take my knight back. And I can't take their rook back, at least not immediately. In fact, they would be threatening the undefended pawn that I'm supposed to have defended some time ago. So that turns out to be a blunder. And it looks like the analysis board here does agree with the game review because that gives my opponent the +3 advantage. And it does suggest them taking my queen, and I'm going to take their queen, but they're also going to get my knight out of this. And that's what my opponent did. So I took their queen, they took my knight, and I played B5, which was my best move. It's one of their top 3 moves to take it, but Stockfish says their best move is just to push past. I think that's to prevent the 2 pawns from working together going up. Also, it keeps these 2 pawns together. If they take and I take back, then we have 2 pawns that are locked up here, I suppose. But it's not that much worse to take, which they did, and I am supposed to take back, which I did. One of their better moves is to finish off that pawn with their bishop, which was already pointed there, and my opponent is up 2.5 points. And I'm a whole piece down, that knight, plus a pawn. So to my credit, I kept playing. Played one of my top moves, which was to go down there and threaten this pawn, which they can't easily defend, and they didn't try to. They moved a knight in here to I guess, let that pawn go, and it is my best move to take it. So I did. I think one of the reasons that they moved their knight here was to protect this spot, and it is one of their top moves to bring their bishop back there, so they did that. It is my best move to take it, and it's their best move to take back. So we're continuing to play, except for my one blunder of miscalculating the queen trade where I would lose an extra piece. Both of us have been playing very close to our best moves on almost every turn. Even when we weren't playing our best moves, we were playing very close to our best moves and keeping the evaluation close to even. Now my best moves just keep the evaluation close to +2.5 or +3. It is one of my best moves to bring that back, to line up with this knight, which forces it to move again, so it went back to where it was. And probably what I should have done here, at least according to Stockfish, is just move over one, so the knight can't immediately threaten me again. And then I suppose before too long, I could double up rooks on the A file. But instead I went back to where I was, which gives us about +3. Absolute best move on my opponent's part. I assume that's to keep my knight from popping in there to G4. Or maybe it's about time, since we don't have queens anymore and I'm a piece down, maybe it's about time for them to start shoving pawns forward. But that was their best move. Instead of doubling up rooks over here on the A file like Stockfish had suggested earlier, I decided to double up on the B file, which takes us a little bit closer to +4, but it wasn't listed as an inaccuracy because it was close to my best move. And my opponent was supposed to double their rooks here too, but they were supposed to double by bringing this rook down and having their both rooks on the 7th. And right after I moved this rook over, I realized that they could do that, but instead they brought the other rook over, which wasn't listed among their best moves, but also not bad enough to be an inaccuracy. But we're still at about +3. I saw that there was a pretty good chance of them starting to come in here, but not yet because they brought the wrong rook down. Also, it looks like they're about to try something here if they can dislodge my knight. Right now, my knight is protecting E8, but if they can find a way to get rid of that knight, maybe with the G-pawn push that I talked about earlier, or maybe something else like bringing this knight in here or this, then they're going to have something very devastating here. So that was my thinking for playing H6. They did play their best move, which was to bring that knight in there. Stockfish says my best move right now is to play rook to B1, which pins this rook to their king. Now, I'm not threatening mate or anything because their king has an escape route, but if they do take mine, then I could take theirs. They would be in check. Their king would have to come out, and I would have won a tempo. But I don't know what I would have done after that. But what I saw was that this pawn here on the D file is undefended, and it's protecting both of those knights. So I brought this rook back to attack that. And that turned out to not be quite precise. So it's at +4 now. But my opponent didn't play very precisely either, and they went to defend that pawn. Whereas they should have just ignored my threat on that pawn. What they should have done was played knight to C6, which is right here. That's probably why my rook move was bad, because that knight move would have forked the rooks. That knight move threatens both my rooks and guards that pawn. But my opponent didn't play that. They played this instead and protected the pawn that way. I did play one of my better moves. My opponent did play their best move, because now that they have this knight here, and now that my knight has moved, their knight's guarding that square. They can come in here. I'm not in check yet. So I took that knight. They took back with the pawn. Now, one thing that does, it not only gives my opponent a passed pawn, but it gives me a passed pawn. And if I move it forward, my rook's protecting it. One of my ideas was to put the other rook behind it and see how far I could push that pawn down. And here's where my opponent blundered. According to the game review, and we'll see if Stockfish here on the analysis tab agrees, my opponent has an almost +5 at this point. And the best move, according to Stockfish, is to play f4. Now, I don't know if that's just to defend this knight, which I'm not attacking at this moment, or if it's to start launching an attack on my castled king. Other moves that would have been great for them were to bring the rook back, since this knight might be needed to stop the passed pawn. It wouldn't be defending the rook anymore, or all the way over here, which would have been great for them. It would have been right behind the passed pawn. But instead, here my opponent decided to fork my rooks, which as we saw was their best move a couple of moves ago. But this takes us back to even. Now it looks like they're attacking this pawn, attacking my rook, and attacking my other rook, right? So I'm going to lose a rook here for a knight. But Stockfish says that this is drawn if I play the absolute best move. Now, I thought during the game that I was probably lost here, because I've been aware this whole time that I was down a full knight, and very recently I went down a pawn again. So I thought, why not do something desperate and crazy? If I go here and they take, I'll take with the other rook, and then I wouldn't have gone down and exchanged the rook for the knight. I would have just traded off another rook. Now, they would still be a piece ahead, but they would be in check. They would have to get out of check. And then I was going to try to find out some sort of solution, like perhaps getting behind this pawn where I could threaten it, which they can't easily protect, and or pushing this pawn down. And I did play that. And that turned out to be one of my great moves listed by the game review. Now, they're not supposed to take it according to Stockfish. Surprisingly, Stockfish says this is their best move right here. Now, I'm not sure why. I don't understand exactly why it's their best move to give up this rook for the pawn. And it says that after I took back with my king, they would just put this rook back over here by their king where I could defend it. And then I would take it and they would take back with their king. And the two pieces left on the board would be this knight and this rook, which is currently in trouble. But what they did instead was take that rook, which of course was my plan for putting it down there in the first place. And I took back with check. Now the reason that turns out to be good for me, and the reason that's a great move, is because remember earlier when they were supposed to move that rook away from my king because their knight couldn't defend it anymore? It's not defended. They have to move out of check, and then I'm going to get that rook. So they moved out of check, and I got that rook. That was listed as one of my great moves as well. And that's why that turned out to be a blunder earlier when they played that, threatening both my rooks, because now I have a rook for a knight. I'm actually up 1 point of material, but their best move is to take my passed pawn, which they did, so now we're exactly even on material. My opponent has 2 extra pawns, and I'm up the exchange, the rook for the knight. One of their pawns is a passed pawn that's getting pretty close to promotion. Now I have several moves here that work, according to the engine. One is to get behind this pawn, which I'm not sure why that would be great. They could defend it just by moving it. Another is to play g6, I guess because that prevents this knight from coming here. Another is rook to c1 to get behind the passed pawn, which I thought was fine, except I went to d1 to force the knight to move because I don't think they're going to push the passed pawn while the knight's in trouble. They played there with their knight, and you can see here that Stockfish gives me a very slight advantage, but just as earlier when my opponent was up plus 0.28 or 0.35, anything between +1 and -1 is almost even, especially at my level. Maybe at high Super Grandmaster levels, 0.56 or 0.63 is a pushable enough advantage, but at my level, it's basically even. And then here, my best move is to get behind the passed pawn, which I did. That's among their best moves, to bring their king. And of course, I get to chop off the passed pawn at this point. So now my opponent has one more pawn than I do, but it's not a passed pawn because I have a pawn that guards that file. Also, my rook is a little bit more mobile than their knight. And we all know that knights are tricky because of their unique ways that they can move, but they can't move as far, as fast as a rook can and get completely to the other side of the board in one move. So that's why the rook is considered generally to be a more powerful piece. My opponent is supposed to bring their knight to d4 at this point, which I don't understand other than it perhaps threatens to attack my rook, or maybe it's to get out of the way of that pawn. But they decided to push this pawn, which isn't horrible. It was among their top moves. We're still at 0.6. My best move was a king move, but I pushed my pawn, which, if you remember, was one of my best moves a few moves ago. The idea was they can't push this one now because then I could take it or push past. very close to their best move, still 0.5 on the minus side, which is in my favor. This takes us back to drawn. What I should have done was played king to e6, according to Stockfish, or rook to c3 check. I think if I had checked, they would have played f3 to block it, which would have served their purpose of advancing that pawn just a little bit. If I had played king to e6, they might still have played f3. What does king to e6 do? It gets away from these two pawns, so I don't know why I probably wouldn't have thought of king to e6. But g5 is just enough of a non-perfect move that it takes us to even if they play h5. But they didn't play h5, they took. And I took back with check, and they have to go to either h3 or f3. They have a few other choices, but those are their two best, and they chose one of them. The engine says I should check again, or again play king to e6, which I'm not sure what that does. I guess maybe it's trying to zigzag up here to get in front of that pawn, but I went that way to protect this pawn. Okay, g3 is one of their two best moves. h5 is one of my two best moves. That's one of their best moves. And here I thought about coming over here, because if I can come down there, I could prevent that pawn from moving. And that turns out to be one of my three best moves, all of which are tied for how good they are. Very close to 0. Same thing here. They have several moves that leave us at 0.03. And then I went ahead with my plan, one of my better moves, to keep that f pawn from moving. Not that it could have moved anyway with their knight in the front of it. Now they just moved their knight back to where it had been. We're basically in a drawn position. I can't advance my pawn without losing it, and they can't advance their pawn without losing it. It's one of my top moves. I thought we were going to repeat here. My opponent had other plans. I came forward, which now means that they can't move this pawn because it's the only thing protecting that knight. So they went back and checked me, and I went back here. Again, wondering if we might repeat, but my opponent decided to check over there. I think the reason was they were hoping to get in some sort of position where they could fork us, but that was another reason that I forgot to mention for moving the rook way over there. When there's a knight on the board and you just have a king and one piece that's not a knight, it's a pretty good idea to keep that piece and your king very far apart. You certainly don't want them close enough together and in the right position where they can be forked by the knight. So that was part of the strategy for having the rook so far away. It is, of course, my best move to come closer to the knight. They can't check me here because of where my rook is, but they're going after the pawn. They can go after the pawn this way, where it'd be protected by their pawn, or they can go after the pawn this way. My best move is actually to bring the rook back to defend the pawn ahead of time, but I didn't yet notice that they were after it. I just decided to move here. I guess I was thinking something along these lines where my king would protect that, but in hindsight, that doesn't seem like a really good idea because they could fork us then. But I had to make a move, and both of us are getting relatively low on time. I've left the clocks on the board so you can see my opponent's down to 9 seconds and I'm down to 22 seconds. Again, opponent plays one of their absolute best moves. I play this move, which keeps us drawn. They take my pawn. I don't know where their knight can go except to here, but I had to make a move with just a couple of seconds left, so they did put their knight there. I brought my king in, which turns out to we're completely drawn. They can check me, of course, and that is listed as one of their top moves, but so is this. I'm attacking the knight, so they probably need to move it, which they did. And you can see the zeros on the board continue to stay as we maneuver these only pieces that we have, and my opponent is just waiting for an opportunity to move their pawns, and they finally have it, so I have to move my king back. There it goes. They bring their king forward to protect the pawns. I was pretty sure here I could force a draw because of the endgame experience that I have had. If you look back, I think it's about a year ago when I studied several endgames in a row, and I put those videos on as teaching videos, as if I was teaching them to newer players, which kind of was the point, but also because I had just learned them, and if I can explain it in a way that a new person could understand it, it meant that I had learned it correctly. And I knew right here that if we had just the two kings and that pawn on the board, that I could force the draw based on the current positioning of our pieces. So I decided to sacrifice the rook because I was pretty sure that my opponent wouldn't push past. I was pretty sure that my opponent would take. After I took the knight with my rook, they would take with their pawn, and I would take that pawn with my king. And that would leave, as I said, the three pieces here, the two kings and the pawn. And because I had done all those endgame studies, I was very, very certain, 98% certain that I could force a draw in that position. So I did that. And it said it was excellent. And now my opponent only has one move that doesn't give me a huge advantage, and that's to take back. And I only have one move that doesn't give my opponent a huge advantage, and that is, of course, to take back. So I did. You can see here that Stockfish gives zeros to several moves for the player with the white pieces. One of them is here, which protects the pawn. One of them was king to h2. And the reason is because in that case, I would just take the pawn. And then, of course, it's a draw. It's a draw by insufficient material. If they try to protect the pawn, which of course they did, because not protecting the pawn is a draw immediately, protecting the pawn just means I'm going to have to force the draw by very, very precise play. Now I have several choices here, but The method that I've learned is just to stay in front of that pawn, unless you can't, and then get in front of their king. And I'll just kind of show you how that works. You just drop back. So they can't move the pawn forward, they have to bring their king forward. But instead they went around behind it, which that allows me to come forward again. So I did. They come around the other way. So I drop back. As long as their king's not close enough and permits me, I stay right in front of that pawn, just moving back and forth. They brought their king, so now I can't move forward to stay in front of the pawn, but now I stay in front of the king. And that turns out to be one of my great moves. Okay, so now of course they're going to push that pawn. No, they went that way. Well, that allows me to get back in front of the pawn again. So they go back to protect the pawn. I drop back. They come forward. I get in front of the king. Now here they decided to move the pawn forward. When that happens, get in front of the pawn. Now this only works if there's only one pawn on the board and your king is right in front of it and their king is kind of behind it, as you can see from the position on the board. Okay, all they can do is get behind that pawn and then I can back up. But they can't push the pawn because I'll take it, so they have to move their king and then I get in front of their king. Now they can check again, but I get in front of the pawn again. So they can't bring their king, they have to get behind it again, and I drop back. We just do this over and over again until I can't drop back anymore. And you'll see what happens when we get to the end. If you haven't been in this situation before, another great move. You saw several of those were listed as great moves, probably because, yeah, in these cases, there's only moves. I think they were listed as great moves because any other move on my part would have resulted in a mating sequence because my opponent would have been able to promote. So that's a great move. But see, now they're going to check me. Well, no, here they decided not to. So I can move up. They go over. I drop back. They come down. I get in front of the king. Well, here my opponent wasn't sure what to do. So I go there. Now the problem, of course, is if they come closer and I move over and they push the pawn, then I get in front of the pawn and they can't do anything. They either get behind the pawn and it's a stalemate because I don't have legal moves, or they have to abandon the pawn and let me take it. Right there turned out to be the last move of the game. And both of us were making these last few moves so quickly that we had built our time back up, as you can see on the clock. So for all the poor performances that I've had in my rapid games and other games, I wanted to kind of take a turn here, a little detour, and show a game in which I did really well. Except, as you can see from that huge blunder at the beginning where I gave away a knight. But then I played optimal moves up until my opponent blundered, thinking they had the fork of my two rooks and the pawn. But I made the best move to get out of that and ended up forcing a draw here. So not everything's going poorly. I just wanted to show you that. And I wanted to go through here and make sure that those actually were great moves because I was surprised when I saw that it said I had 12 great moves in the game review. Also, it says at the bottom of the game review, it says my opponent played like a 1650 and I played like a 1700, which of course I don't have those ratings in any of the time controls on chess.com. And in Bullet, this was the highest I've ever been in Bullet, which is 990. I believe this was a week or two ago, so now I'm back down in the 800s. Thank you for spending your time here. I do appreciate it. And I'll see you next time.